In the wake of the recent Top 25 video, there were a lot of questions directed towards where certain games were, and I'm here to answer as many of them as possible and explain some reasoning, round the list up to 30 and then show you my top 10 list if I was just talking about my personal favourites. So let's start off with the ones I didn't talk about and where they are. The most mentioned one I haven't done was Forbidden Siren. It's a game that I'm working on for this year's Halloween. I've not finished playing it, and there's no way I'm putting it onto a list until I've done the review and gathered my thoughts on it. Clock Tower is another game I also haven't done, so again, haven't put it on the list. I'm hoping once the new re-release comes out, I'll be covering it then. One of the biggest questions was, where is Resident Evil 7? And yeah, it was hard to choose between 2 and 7, as 7 is considered a far scarier game. I personally don't find the game that scary, but the main reason why it wasn't on the list is because I think the game has lower lows. When Resident Evil 2 stays consistent throughout, Resident Evil 7's boat section slows the game right down, and then doing the boat section a second time often leads me to audibly groan when playing the game. I think different people find this section more fun than others, but by choosing one game per franchise, 2 pushed out 7 for that reason alone. I will always choose a game that's more consistent throughout. Again, a lot of people prefer Amnesia the Bunker over the Dark Descent, and I totally understand. I chose the Dark Descent because the story, in my opinion, is deeper and better conveyed to the player. Another thing that cropped up was, why is Bloodborne on the list? And I can understand that technically Bloodborne is not strictly a horror game, and in the future I'm going to determine horror games based on Wikipedia definitions and Steam tags in an effort to prevent this kind of debate. But in my defense, Bloodborne has an atmosphere far superior to a lot of actual horror games. Really great storytelling that is probably one of the few games to ever tell a cosmic horror story in a fitting and fragmented way, and then it has lots of blood and gore, a great soundtrack, and combat that can also be frightening based on its difficulty alone. I'd also already reviewed the game, so I can't really ignore it from here on out. So even if nowhere else considers it a horror game, we do on this channel. And the last thing I need to point out was, I've done nearly 230 horror game reviews on the channel, and when I was making up the top 25 list, I compared it to another list of every game I've reviewed, so as long as I've covered it, I considered it for the list. So I can say with certainty there wasn't anything forgotten. So for games that didn't make the list, to put it bluntly, I just didn't think it was as good as the things I had chosen. Feel free to direct your disappointment towards my judgment rather than my memory. But to be honest, I don't think you can really rank games like this against each other, especially games that are like radically different in both tone and design. People wanted a more traditional list, but I think straight up ranking things makes it unfair against games that are like survival horror versus psychological horror. Things frightening in different ways. Some things that really rely more on gore, games come out in all shapes and sizes, and saying one is better than another is pretty flawed from the start. There's nothing really objective about it. But also, choosing just 25 games was really restricting, and there are probably a few more I could have added to the bottom end of the list. So, here's another 4 from positions 30 to 26. Number 30, Layers of Fear. Layers of Fear follows a painter who, through his own obsession with art, gets sucked into his own tormented world and seemingly endless shape-shifting mansion he can't seem to escape from. Layers of Fear presents one of the best haunted house exploration games there is, with some fascinating scripted events and mind-bending visuals, even though some of them are a bit hit and miss. The game is only really this low on the list because of how it really struggles to be replayable, with it essentially being the exact same thing every time you play through it. And due to its linear and scripted nature, sadly the game ends up suffering greatly with each subsequent playthrough. The main appeal? The scripted events. If you've never seen them, they are extremely entertaining and dazzling, with some being strange and others being disturbing or unnerving. Number 29, Fear Extraction Point. Fear Extraction Point is the DLC for Fear and follows the Point Man, the playable character of the main game, as they continue onwards from Fear's ending and try to escape the nightmare the city has become in the wake of a massive explosive detonation. Fear is still a combat-first first-person shooter, but Extraction Point did a better job of introducing more horror elements throughout the game, rather than what the base game did, which was split things up from shooting sections to horror sections, and Extraction Point blends them together with some really impressive scripted events and more horror-focused combat. Main appeal: despite how much better the horror elements are, the bullet time combat is still ridiculously fun and continues to be some of the most enjoyable I can think of. Number 28, Penumbra: Black Plague. Black Plague follows Philip in the sequel to Overture as he awakens in the facility deep below the Greenland ice. The place has been taken over by infected and he's stripped of his weapons, alone, and then he starts hearing voices in his head. Black Plague was really the beginning of the Amnesia formula that went on to make games like The Dark Descent and Soma so good, and whilst Black Plague did it first, it's early days of the formula and certainly things hold it back, though it still keeps up the tension really high as you run away from the strange-looking infected. The main appeal: the gameplay of running away from enemies and solving puzzles may have been refined in the future, but Black Plague still does it really well.
This is all your fault. I regret every second with you. Time is running out, Rebecca.
Number 27, The Mortuary Assistant. The Mortuary Assistant follows Rebecca, a trainee mortician, as on the first night of her job she's locked inside the mortuary and must exorcise the demon that's tormenting her by burning it alive in one of the bodies she prepares. Preparing bodies is naturally unpleasant, but on top of that, the game does an incredible job with so many different jump scares and scripted events that really makes each playthrough interesting to say the least. Though not every single one of its scares lands, it throws so many at you that one will eventually, and it's worth replaying just to find and experience different things. The main appeal? Variety. From the subtle to the in-your-face, Mortuary Assistant has so many ways in which the game tries to scare or unsettle the player, so much so that it can really only be appreciated after several playthroughs, which is highly recommended.
I have come.
Number 26, From the Darkness. From the Darkness is a short but really intensely frightening game about a man returning to his grandfather's house after he died to collect the family photo album, but once he enters, he finds it's not so easy to leave. The game is a perfectly executed linear ride that contains a lot of really intense moments and bewildering and nerve-wracking events. Though the game is really light on story, it manages to create a menacing atmosphere and keep that high going for the duration of the game, even if it isn't very long. Even after playing this game a year later, the game still manages to be frightening, which was quite impressive. The main appeal? The atmosphere and difficult situations the game keeps putting you into, but also the scripted events and inventive way that it keeps things going. There are a lot of things I'd love to include on the list, like Haunting Ground, Alice Madness Returns, Scorn, Anatomy, Discover My Body, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Scratches, Phasmophobia, Metro 2033, Condemned Criminal Origin, System Shock 2, No One Lives Under the Lighthouse, Sanitarium, and SCP Containment Breach, but the list would go on forever. There's too many games that I'd put on an even bigger list. But now we're done with my critical opinion, which is what the list was. It's time for me to indulge a little and talk about my favourite games. The list would look totally different if I was just choosing my favourites, and there's no way to rank these based on how much I like them, because moods change and fade over time. So here's a collection. Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. There is a fair amount of overlap between the critical list and the personal list, and Stalker is one of those that I genuinely really enjoy playing, but also think it's generally really good. It can be absolutely terrifying, and its atmosphere is unforgettable, like a strange land you're returning to. I love how miserable the environments are, and the isolation. I think the soundtrack and weird monster noises you hear randomly make the game feel more alive. And while Shadow of Chernobyl is probably more scripted than the other games, it feels realistic enough whilst you're playing, helping out factions or relaxing in the bar area before going out on the next adventure that will almost certainly get you killed, or at least irradiated. Praise be to quick saving. I like the twitch reaction combat. It's as frightening as it is exciting to only just manage to defeat an enemy before they defeat you, and creeping around a populated enemy base provides tension like no other. I like the inventory management and finding strange new items and artifacts. I love all the weird creatures from the Poltergeist to the Bloodsuckers 2. It's easily one of my favourite games of all time, and whilst I'm not a huge fan of Clear Sky, Call of Pripyat is really good too if you need more grim times in the zone. Soma. Soma is another one on the overlap list. When I've made 3 different videos about it, you know that I'm pretty interested in it. Soma is the best kind of overlap in the way that I'm so impressed with how everything in that game comes together that I can't help but poke and prod at it to find new things, and nearly every time I've played I've noticed something new, from its story and interactivity. There's loads of smaller things you might not even notice when you play, like trying to contact Theta when you're in Upsilon gives you Strasky's voice, who should probably have been dead by the time you're in Upsilon.
Here.
Or contacting the wrong climber in Delta lets you talk to a person called Alan who's had their personality imprinted onto the climber and is now stuck somewhere lost and confused.
It's everywhere.
What? Hello?
All that water. We're drowning.
Who is this?
Alan. What's your name?
Simon. Where... What are you? Alan, can you hear me? Alan?
All of this stuff reinforces the story as well, and it's just so impressive to me. It's like an interconnected web of things that lets you find more pieces of its immaculate jigsaw puzzle the more you explore. I like its story, obviously, I like its characters, I like its setting and monster design, I like the soundtrack and the freedom you get to explore Pathos 2 and the ocean. It's another one of my favourite games, and I'll make any excuse I can to talk about it. Sanitarium. Sadly, I don't have much footage of this one. I'm still re-recording it, so you'll have to make do with a bit of a cut down entry. Sanitarium is, in my personal opinion, weird done right. I find personally that the weird things I see in Bloober Team games never really affect me in a way that I feel they're trying to, but Sanitarium is so dated and weird that it gets under my skin flawlessly every time. Things happen that are grim and unexpected, and Max accepts things whilst acknowledging that they're strange. He's more of a relatable voice of reason. Again, I love the soundtrack and think that Sanitarium is the most surreal adventure in horror games that also just works.
But it looks like you're going to die soon.
Maybe. But you'll have to pardon me while I tend to some unfinished business first.
Business? What can you possibly accomplish in your condition? You can't even hold your gun steady.
Well, no, unless I try. That thing's not gonna die unless I shoot it 2 or 3 times.
Cadela. Again, I don't have much footage of this one, so it's another cut down entry. It's a really obscure game for sure, but Cadela is one of the few games that just ticks all the boxes for me, with its weird monsters, cool soundtrack, gnarly PlayStation 1 graphics, and it's a turn-based RPG on top of all of that. You can use guns, and its grid-based combat feels unique in comparison to what I'm personally used to. The character animation is really good for PlayStation 1, and I love the way the magic sounds in the game. The story is a classic gothic horror one that gets expanded on in its sequel, Shadow Hearts, which is also a great game, but Cadela is just a lot of my personal favourite things combined. Mundon. Mundon is one of those games where it's so strange and surreal that I was just in childlike wonder experiencing it. From things like the painting that sucks you in at the start, literally, to the odd characters and weird supernatural vibe, the straw men enemies and its sometimes beautiful and mysterious soundtrack. This game really was just made for me. But it's not the horror elements that enchant me, it's the driving, the silly sled racing minigames, eating cheese and bread to increase your health, drinking coffee to get brave, picking up different radio stations to play in the car, and even just milling about in the various places you can spend the night in Mundon won me over really early. It goes its own way with a lot of things, for better or for worse, and it's so unique that I wish more games indulged themselves like this. Fear. Fear is a game I've played through many times just because it's really fun. The bullet time combat is just fantastic and never gets old. I like the setting, especially the waterworks area with all its moody lighting. But you really could set the game anywhere and I'd still have fun with it. I don't even have that much to say about Fear, I just think it's a really good time. Montas. Montas is one of the biggest letdowns for me. It's an unfinished game where you explore a surreal nightmare town, and it explains nothing and lets you explore its weird world on your own terms. Like Soma, I liked poking and prodding at it to try and find new things lurking around in it, but sadly Montas being unfinished is full of rough edges and doesn't really seem to end. The more you push it, the more it breaks. I still play it for the electric feel and the freedom to explore this weird town. Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame 1 was the first game to properly frighten me since Amnesia: The Dark Descent, when I played that back when it came out, and I'd only ever seen it when I watched a YouTube video of a guy absolutely losing his mind in fear in the doll room, and I was so eager to try it myself. I love playing the game because it's so creepy and the folklore stuff you find is so eerie. I still find the game really hard and I've only ever finished it once, but I still replay it whenever given the option. I love the story and still think the combat is at its best in this game, and those cutscenes are just incredible.
Blending into your blood will make you a stronger being. You will be faster. You will be a complete being. Oh, marvelously complete.
Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. This game is really cheesy with the whole light versus dark thing that feels so cliche in horror, but I still really love this game's story for all of the backstory and diary entries between family members, and a history that goes back like 200 years. I love the soundtrack to this game and the design and look of all the rooms. I was such a big fan of this game back in the day that I tried to recreate the Morton Manor in The Sims 2. I have the official comic book that came out with this, and at one point I had the game on every console. So you can say that I at least like the game. I love the interactions between Carby and Aline and really enjoy the weapons, which are unique with the triple barrel shotgun and the photoelectric pulsar. But it's not the best game ever. There are so many flaws, especially in the second half of both characters' games. And finally, Silent Hill 3. I talk about Silent Hill 1 and 2 a lot as sort of a occupational hazard, but 3 has and always will be my favourite game. Heather is my favourite Silent Hill protagonist, and I love all the silly outfits you can get for her and the dumb weapons you can get, and underneath that there's actually a really good horror game too. I'd love to come back and talk more about Silent Hill 3 in the future as it's overshadowed by the games that came before it, but it's still a really top tier game. The soundtrack is insanely good and the environment design is in its best in this one.
Oh, forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
Well, that's enough rambling. This has been a bit of an interruption to what was originally planned, but the next time I'll be searching for the scariest game. And I might also make different videos searching for the most atmospheric game, the goriest game, the game of the best story, and maybe even the game with the best sound design. If the next one goes well. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoy it.
It's not enough.